Folks are trickling in, so we will probably get started about 5 after to give people time to get admitted into the presentation. Molly, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So I will keep my eye on the waiting room and let people in as they add themselves. We are recording today's session, so I will make sure that folks who are on this call are able to access the recording in case you have to drop off early or you have technical difficulties, which is bound to happen in today's virtual world. So just letting you know, it is being recorded. So welcome everybody to a very special Week Without Violence presentation, How to Support a Survivor When Calling the Police is Not an Option. co-presented by Washburn University Campus Advocate Molly Steffes-Herman and the YWCA Center for Safety and Empowerment Public Education Coordinator Emily Steimel-Handy, which is me. We wanted to thank you first and foremost for taking the time out of your day to join us in this very crucial conversation around the impact of domestic violence and taking the steps to learn how to support a survivor of intimate partner violence in your own world. We do not do this work alone, and together is the only way that we will truly eliminate domestic violence in our communities. We know that not all violence is acknowledged or responded to equally, and that some victim survivors go unrecognized altogether. That is why for more than 20 years, the YWCA Northeast Kansas has set aside 1 week in October as a week without violence to honor Domestic Violence Awareness Month. The Week Without Violence is part of a global movement to end domestic and gender-based violence in all forms. The YWCA Northeast Kansas joins YWCAs across the country to bring awareness to these issues during the week of October 18th through 24th. We believe that united action is powerful, and we believe that all forms of violence are connected. This year, for Week Without Violence 2020, we're heralding the message until justice just is. This moment in time and the happenings in our country require us to leverage our collective capacity and courage to identify and address the different ways that bias, prejudice, and oppression contribute to domestic violence and survivors' access to safety and support. We know that Native and Indigenous women, immigrant women, women of color, women with disabilities, and the LGBTQ+ community face heightened risks of violence and greater barriers to legal remedies and supportive services due to many complex factors that we will visit today. We are utilizing this Week Without Violence to highlight the intersectionality of racial justice, gender justice, and survivor justice, and to shine a light on the devastating effects of domestic violence within marginalized communities. We all have a common goal in mind: to educate, to engage, and to empower until justice just is for all survivors. So today we will be talking about ways that you can help someone who might be experiencing intimate partner violence. We will be giving you some tools and some tips on how to validate, on how to support, empower, and connect a survivor to resources that can help. We will also be providing some facts and stats on domestic violence, both nationally and locally. We'll be debunking myths around domestic violence and providing you with resources so that you may help survivors in your own circle thrive, whether through law enforcement, a friend, a coworker, a family member, a faith leader, or an advocate, or any other method. Survivors should be met with support, love, and safety. So we are your presenters for today. Like I said, my name is Emily Steimel-Handy, and I'm the Public Education Coordinator at the YWCA Center for Safety and Empowerment. And Molly.
I'm Molly Steffes-Herman. I am the Campus Advocate for main campus at Washburn University. And we would like Shelly Bierman to introduce herself as well.
Hi, I'm Shelly Bierman. I'm the Campus Advocate at Washburn Institute of Technology. We have a new position for advocacy starting January of this year. So we've been very, very busy. The need is great, and it's exciting to be a part of this community. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shelly.
So Becca, the program director at the Center for Safety and Empowerment, will be monitoring our chat box throughout today's presentation. So at the end, we will have space available for questions, but if you have questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat box, and then Becca can let us know when we have questions coming in. So those of you who are football fans or might be following football right now, we all know that this is Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City, right? Does anybody, any major football fans out there, know how many people can fit in Arrowhead Stadium? You can either put it in the chat box or you can unmute yourself.
Isn't it like 74,614 or something like that?
That is a very specific number and very close. Good job, Cam. The actual number is 76,416 people pre-COVID. So obviously we know that COVID has impacted the number of people who can be seated in the stadium. So we talk about that number because that's a very large number, right? A whole stadium full of fans. But according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, on average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. So that's about more than 10 million men and women every year. So 1 in 3 women and 1 in 7 men experience severe intimate partner violence, which might include sexual violence or stalking. And we'll talk more about what that looks like locally on the next slide. So talking about how important this conversation is, because we know that a lot of us who are on this call have either directly experienced domestic violence ourselves, or we know somebody who has experienced domestic violence. So it's so important that we know what to do when we are ever faced with a survivor disclosure. So, right, we tend to think that things don't happen in our area, or that they don't happen in Kansas, or they don't happen in our community, they don't happen in our neighborhood. But when we look at the most recent report from the KBI that's specific to domestic violence in Kansas, we see that that is not the case. So in 1 year alone, these are from 2018, in 1 year alone in Kansas, law enforcement saw 24,000 incidents of domestic violence. So that means that one domestic violence incident occurred every 21 minutes here in our state. We saw 37 domestic violence homicides in that year, and the total homicides for the state was 146. So quite a few of those were domestic violence related. We saw 900 incidents of stalking and over 1,300 incidents of rape. And these are the only ones that were reported to law enforcement, which we will talk specifically about later on, about the lack of reporting and why survivors don't report. And so we know that these are big numbers, but it's also not the full picture. So we know that domestic and gender-based violence occurs across all races, ages, classes, gender identities, sexual orientations, and ethnic backgrounds. Though it occurs at higher rates and with disproportionate impacts in specific communities, such as Native and Indigenous communities, communities of color, Latinx communities, specifically affecting our immigrant population, survivors with disabilities, and the LGBTQ+ community, specifically affecting trans women of color. While many experiences of survivors cut across all racial, ethnic, and class lines, due to very complex histories with these systems, due to oppression, bias, and prejudice, survivors of color and survivors within marginalized communities face increased difficulty when it comes to finding safety and support, which we'll talk more directly about. So when we're taking into consideration survivors within marginalized communities being less likely to feel safe seeking support and help, it is very likely that you, all of you on this call, could very well be the first line of response for a survivor of domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, or stalking. So we know that survivors in general are more likely to disclose their abuse to a friend, to a family member, a coworker, a teacher, a counselor, or a faith leader before they ever access help from the community service agency, or before they ever go to a hospital, or before they ever call police, or even come to an agency like the Center for Safety and Empowerment. So knowing the prevalence of domestic violence, the likelihood is very great that you or someone you know has experienced or is currently experiencing some form of gender-based violence. So being knowledgeable of the resources available in your community, being better prepared to respond will hopefully help you feel more comfortable and more empowered when faced with a disclosure of abuse. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Molly to talk more about what domestic violence is and what it is not.
Okay. So what do we mean when we say domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern of physical, sexual, and or emotional abuse in a relationship used to gain and maintain power and control. Domestic violence occurs in intimate and former intimate partner relationships. Intimate relationships include current or former spouses, partners, significant others, boyfriends, girlfriends, gay, lesbian, heterosexual couples, cisgender and transgender couples, intersex and bisexual individuals, family members, those who share a child together, those who reside together, and those who provide services to dependent people. So let's talk about some of the myths behind domestic violence. So lots of us have heard, that domestic violence is an issue of anger management, lack of marriage or couples counseling, mental illness, substance abuse, or an issue resulting in the victim's behavior or retaliation. These are all myths. These things may complicate a situation and make an abusive relationship more complex. They may impact a survivor's overall safety and danger level, and may be used as a tactic to gain and maintain power and control, and may be an aspect of why they stay or do not leave a relationship, but they are not the root cause of domestic violence. So this is the power and control wheel that was created by Ellen Pence, and it is used to describe the different tactics abusers use to gain and maintain power and control in abusive relationships. Once again, when we want to take into consideration intersectionality, when we discover power and control and ways in which survivors who are experiencing layers of oppression and survivors within marginalized communities as they are experiencing these tactics in complex ways, making it more dangerous and harder to seek help and support. Abusers oftentimes leverage oppression, bias, and prejudice to heighten the abuse. So how do we think this power and control wheel plays out in the abuse of a survivor within a marginalized community, such as Native and Indigenous populations, LGBTQIA+ populations, Black, Latinx, immigrant, or differently abled populations?
So you can either unmute yourself or you can put in the chat box some of your thoughts regarding what power and control might look like in specific populations. So absolutely can affect someone's ability to get help, right? Which we talked about earlier. There might be some additional safety considerations that we need to take into thought when we're thinking about a survivor in a marginalized community. using others, right? Specifically thinking about our topic of today and maybe using police to further manipulate or threaten a survivor. They may not be believed by helpers or other social service agencies, law enforcement, whoever it might be that they have disclosed to. Their abuse might not be understood by helping agencies, as well as if it were a cisgender white woman, etc.
They think maybe it's not that bad or they're not physically able. Lack of self-esteem to stand up for themselves.
Yeah, these are all great. Thank you.
Yeah, especially if, you know, an individual has experienced this oppression their entire lives. Like that plays out very differently than somebody who's been in a place of privilege.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So why don't they just leave, right? If it's so bad, why don't they just leave an abusive relationship? This is probably one of the most common responses to the issue of domestic violence. And it is something that I know as an advocate, we hear all the time. And sometimes we have to remember that even the survivor does not have a true understanding of why they stay. But when this question comes up, we have to think to ourselves, what's really being asked of the survivor when we ask them, why don't you just leave? Right? We are telling them, maybe not meaning to say this, but we are telling that survivor to take responsibility and take accountability for someone else's behavior to stop the abuse and the violence. Remember, survivors don't have control over that abuser's choices and decisions, and they are oftentimes made powerless in that relationship. So in this video that we are going to play, hopefully it works, we will hear directly from survivors on why they stayed and the complex and dangerous dynamics that played into their individual experiences that made it unsafe for them to leave. This video is emotional and discusses real stories of domestic violence, so please practice self-care as we play this video.
It is the question that I'm asked the most. Why did I stay? Why does any woman stay? And for the life of me, I can't understand why people are obsessed with it, because to me it's so obvious. Why does anybody stay with somebody that they love? You know, we've all been in relationships that, even if they weren't abusive, we're not working any longer, and we all stay far longer than we want. And you stay for the same reasons. You stay because you love the person, or you love what you used to have, or you're trying to take care of your children.
When we ask, why did you stay? You know, we're blaming the victim for their abuse, as opposed to asking, why did you hit this person? Or why are you violent? Or why do you feel the need to be violent?
Why would somebody abuse? Why would somebody beat the people who love him or her most on earth? Till we ask that question, we won't be able to obliterate domestic violence. We have got to focus on the perpetrators of violence, not the victims.
It's cliche, but he really was Prince Charming. He was very kind and sweet and nice. I left what I was doing to come and be with him, and I was alone with him. I didn't have any friends or family in the area. I couldn't find a job, so he paid the bills, and so we got into an argument, and that's the first time that after we got married, it didn't stop. It just got worse and worse and worse. And I felt like I was trapped. At that point, we had moved from where we were across the country again, and I was further isolated. I didn't have any friends or family, and essentially he still was the breadwinner. I was dependent on him. So if I left, what was I gonna do? Where was I gonna go? You know, how was I gonna take care of myself? I felt like no one would understand, and I felt like no one would care.
The first full-out physical attack was 5 days before the wedding. Part of me knew I had to leave him right then, that I couldn't marry somebody who had done this. But then this other part of me said, but wait, it was one time. And I told myself he'd never do it again, that I was sure he was very sorry, and I didn't leave. I married him. You stayed with this guy.
Yeah, I didn't have a choice. I mean, he told me, and I absolutely, you know, that's the part that always, it's so interesting to me. It's like, you know, the standard question, why do you leave? Why do you leave? Why do you leave? Well, he was trained by the United States Marine Corps to hunt people down and kill them, and he told me if I left, he would hunt me down and kill me. That's why I didn't leave. I used to pull what he would call my disappearing acts, and that would be, I would, you know, get the boys and get out, because it just was getting too intense. But I would always go back because at least I knew where he was. At least I knew the routine. I knew what to expect. But, you know, it's a terrible way to live, to always be looking over your shoulder. He didn't start out with being abusive. He started out with being incredibly sweet, and incredibly attentive, and incredibly thoughtful, and incredibly kind, and saying things to me that no one had ever said, and paying attention to me in ways that no one ever had. You know, and I was really taken by it.
One of the reasons why we stay is because the behavior is such a drastic change from the person we met in the beginning. And we're constantly looking for the man in the beginning instead of concentrating on the man that is in front of us. Once I understood that, then I made the decision, you know, I gotta go. This is not the same man I married. I mean, I love him, but he's gonna kill me.
With every violent moment, I felt further connected to him in this kind of twisted way. I felt that, you know, we had this secret that bound us together, and that this was something big, and we were working on it. And so we had to stay together until we worked it out. The violence got to a point where I realized that I could die. I had to create a plan. I had to figure out where I was going to go and how I was going to get there and who I was going to reach out to for help if there was any. I was scared. I was afraid that he would find me. I was afraid that he would be so angry that I left, that he would come after me. I couldn't just get up and walk away.
And it was the most terrible feeling to know that I could leave and I still couldn't leave because I was bound by this psychological trap that I thought was love, that wasn't love. You know, I had so much denial. If you had come to me and said, are you being physically abused? You know, if my doctor had asked me or a best friend, I would have said, no, I'm not being physically abused.
You do feel isolated and you keep a lot of secrets. You know, you keep a lot of secrets in your heart, in your home, in your head. I stayed because I believed him when he said he wasn't going to do it again. I stayed because I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have any money. I didn't have access to any resources. I stayed because my religious community convinced me that I couldn't get divorced because God would hate me. I stayed because I loved him. You know, I stayed because he was the love of my life, and I wanted to believe that love could conquer all, including abuse.
So these are certainly some of the reasons that we hear from survivors, but this is certainly not an exhaustive list of why they may choose to stay in an abusive relationship. And we also have to take into consideration that survivors in marginalized populations might include some additional barriers, such as fear of the criminal justice system, lack of financial safety nets, religious and cultural barriers, fear of deportation, lack of awareness or knowledge of the legal system, lack of adequate childcare services, lack of low-cost housing options, and skepticism of social service institutions. So when we're thinking about a lack of job stability, unemployment, the nation's history of segregation, and the strain of navigating racism, we can talk specifically about how these barriers are more complex for survivors of color. In a national survey, more than 60% of LGBTQ+ sexual and domestic violence survivors said that they were denied access to domestic violence shelters when they tried to seek safety. And furthermore, more than half of transgender individuals who accessed homeless shelters were harassed by shelter staff and residents, and almost 30% of them were turned away altogether. So this is going to even further isolate a survivor who is a part of a marginalized community and make it harder for them to seek safety and support. So instead of focusing on why survivors stay, we really should be asking why that person abuses or why that person hurts someone else. Only then can we truly address the root causes to the epidemic of domestic violence. We also need to look at and understand that leaving a domestic violence relationship does not mean that the abuse will stop. In fact, many abusers escalate their tactics of violence during and after separations, or when they perceive that they are losing some sort of power and control over the victim survivor. So this can be when there is a breakup, when somebody files for separation or divorce, when the survivor moves out, when they go to a shelter, when they go to ask for help, when they're starting to seek outside resources, when they file a protection order, when they file for citizenship status apart from their abuser. They might file for custody of the children, etc. So in these moments, survivors are actually at the highest risk of intimate partner homicide. And we specifically want to look at how that risk increases drastically by 500% when the abuser has access to a firearm or there are firearms in the home. So specifically, women of color, Native and Indigenous women, and Black women, and trans women are more likely to be murdered by an intimate partner than a white cisgender woman. So we need to take these considerations into effect when we are helping or trying to support a survivor of domestic violence. So why do we victim blame? Because when we think about other forms of trauma, such as active duty military, a car accident, a loss of a home, a divorce, a natural disaster, or if we're looking at domestic violence or sexual assault, we need to have a conversation about how we have very different reactions to victims based on the type of trauma that they have experienced. So for instance, when somebody experiences a natural disaster, right? A flood, a tornado, a hurricane, something of that effect, usually help is initiated on a very wide scale, right? We have people coming from all over the country to support victims, to help victims get to safety, to clean up. And that help is initiated by the community, or it's initiated on a national scale. It's not initiated by the specific victims who experience that trauma. And oftentimes those victims are met with empathy, they're met with compassion. We understand that that trauma of of a disaster is out of that person's control, and that it's going to have massive, long-lasting effects and devastation on that victim, right? There might be loss of employment, there might be loss of housing, there might be loss of autonomy, loss of finances, and we understand that that is going to linger in that victim's life. However, we don't really respond in that same way when we're talking about a victim of domestic or sexual violence, right? We tend to blame, we tend to shame, we tend to minimize the trauma that they have experienced, although the effects of that trauma on our brain and on our bodies is the exact same of if it's domestic violence or sexual violence, or if it's active duty military, or if it's a natural disaster, right? Trauma is trauma, and our body and our brains are impacted in the same way. However, they are not met with empathy and compassion. They oftentimes have to initiate their own assistance, right? They have to be the ones to seek help from outside agencies or from individuals. It's not that the help comes to them. And they're oftentimes met with blame and shame when they seek help. They're met with that blame and shame from individuals in their lives, from service agencies, from systems, and from themselves. And it's because we have this innate belief that we can't be harmed by others if we do all of the right things, right? So if we don't wear a certain thing, if we call police, if we don't go to a certain area, if we don't engage in certain activities or behaviors, then that won't happen to us. This gives us a sense of control over the trauma that can or can't happen to us. And if we can find something that that victim did or didn't do, and we do something different than them, then it won't happen to us. But we have to remember that trauma completely overwhelms our capacity to utilize coping skills, and it floods our road to rational thought. It impacts our ability to regulate our emotions, to process our reactions, to problem solve, to utilize our higher level of thinking, right? So it impacts all of these things so that we might not always make the decision that somebody on the outside looking in would have done if they were in our shoes, right? So not only are we blaming the survivor, but that survivor is also blaming themselves, and they're also overwhelmed by trauma. Because we have to remember that when that trauma settles and when our brains and our bodies start to regulate, that's when that coulda, shoulda, woulda sets in for that survivor. And if they're met with that when they're trying to seek help and support, that's going to limit their ability to be able to seek safety for themselves, and they might not reach out in the future when they're in a situation of abuse.
So why don't survivors of domestic and sexual violence call the police? They are often asked after they experience violence, why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you make a report? This is oftentimes a knee-jerk response, and although it's not ill-intended, it's not helpful for survivors and victims to hear. The answer to this question is complicated and will vary from survivor to survivor because each person's story is complicated and unique. This means that each person's situation deserves a unique and thoughtful response. So let's look at these reasons. No phone access, limited access, or perhaps they're being monitored by their abuser. So their line of communication to law enforcement may be iffy or non-existent. Their abuser, perpetrator, is connected to law enforcement some way. So this could be, an abuser reminding a survivor victim that they are associated with law enforcement, that they have a friend or family in law enforcement. This can make law enforcement feel unsafe. Distrust and fear of police, fear of arrest themselves, of deportation, losing their children, of being misgendered, or impacts on their tribal associations, racial and gender profiling, fear that they're not going to be believed when the officer gets there, fear that they're going to be blamed for the abuse, past experiences with law enforcement, whether it is the agency that will be responding to their call, or an agency in their past that has really scared them of utilizing law enforcement. Fear that nothing is going to happen when an officer shows up. Escalation in violence, both from law enforcement and from their abuser. Fear of police brutality against themselves and their abuser. Language barriers. Economic consequences. So this goes back to if the abuser is the person who is bringing in income. If they go to jail, there's no income coming into the family. Or if the victim survivor is the person whose income is supporting the household and the abuser is watching the children, they have no source of childcare. So the victim survivor may not be able to go to work. So economic consequences and barriers are a huge, huge, huge obstacle to overcome. And also living in a rural area, whether that means they are physically distant from where law enforcement is located. It may take 30 to 40 minutes for an officer to respond to a call, or there is just not enough officer response because officers are covering a large area in those rural locations in our state. So these barriers, compounded with institutional and historical factors in the lack of safe and culturally competent resources, can oftentimes become heightened when survivors are part of a marginalized community, such as survivors of color, immigrant survivors, LGBTQIA+ survivors, and survivors who live within impoverished neighborhoods, ultimately giving those survivors fewer options for seeking justice, safety, and help. So what do we mean when we say that being involved with the criminal justice system can re-traumatize victims and survivors if nothing happens? So if we look at this infographic from RAIN, we can see that out of every 1,000 rapes, 994 perpetrators will walk free. So out of 1,000 rapes, statistically 310 are reported to police. 57 of those reports lead to an actual arrest. From that arrest, 11 cases will get referred to the prosecutors, the district attorney in Shawnee County. 7 cases will lead to a felony conviction, and 6 rapists will be incarcerated out of 1,000 rapes. And so this is, you know, such a perfect example of, you know, what victim survivors face when they are reaching out to make reports or to contact law enforcement for support. You know, they may not receive the support or the outcome that they're looking for when they reach out for support.
So let's talk about perception, because I think it's really important, especially being aware of our own bias and our own privilege when we are working with a survivor of domestic violence. So I'm sure you all have seen these images before, right? So when we look at the first one over here, on the left side, do you see an old woman or do you see a young woman, right? And your answers are going to vary based on your perception. In the middle, do you see a blue and black dress? Do you see a white and gold dress? And on the end, do you see 2 faces or do you see a vase? So just because you see these images differently than somebody else, right? We probably all saw something different than the neighbor or the person who might also be watching this with us. But that doesn't mean that either of us are wrong, right? That doesn't mean that one answer is right and one answer is wrong, because as Cam has said, they see blue and black, right? And I see white and gold personally, and I don't see how anybody else can see blue and black. But we're not going to further divide ourselves over the blue and the black dress and the white and the gold dress. So this is the same when we're talking about trauma and how we experience that trauma, how we process that trauma, how we navigate it, how we cope with it, right? How a traumatic event is processed is going to be unique to each individual person. And that's going to be based on their past experiences, and where they are physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually at the time that that trauma happens. So even if we've experienced multiple traumas in our past, we might process and navigate each individual trauma differently. And so sometimes we might access services and other times we won't. Sometimes we might call the police and sometimes we won't. We may leave, sometimes we won't. And that doesn't mean that one way is right and one way is wrong. That just means that we are doing what feels most safe for ourselves in that individual moment. And we have to remember that even though a certain service, such as police, were helpful and safe maybe to us in a situation, does not mean that if that option is going to be helpful and safe to every survivor. So like saying things like, well, I called the police when I was experiencing domestic violence, or I left when I was experiencing domestic violence, so you should do those things too. It worked for me, so it should work for you. Because that's not going to be the case. And based on our individual experiences with trauma, it's going to affect how our brain is mapped, which we'll talk about on the next slide about brain mapping. But we just want to take into consideration that each individual is unique and they are going to see things differently and they are going to experience things differently. So when we think about brain mapping, when we think of a shark, what are some words or things that come into mind when we think of a shark? Or what are we conditioned or taught to do when we see a shark in the ocean? Right? We're probably thinking that it's a dangerous animal, right? That it's a powerful animal, it's a predator. And if we see one when we're on a boat, or if we see one if we're in the ocean, right, our first instinct and what we're taught and conditioned to do is get away from that, right? Because that is a dangerous mammal that I do not want to be around. It can eat me in one bite. So I'm going to do whatever I can to get out and away from that animal. So when we think of a dolphin, right, what words come to mind, or what are we conditioned or taught when it comes to seeing a dolphin in the ocean? Right? We think of dolphins as majestic creatures. They're beautiful, they're cute, they're harmless. We might even pay a lot of money to go swim with dolphins. If we see one when we're on a boat, we're going to take pictures of it. They're smart, they're intelligent animals. We have very different thoughts when we think of a shark versus when we think of a dolphin, right? Sharks are danger and dolphins are safe. And even when we think about how these individual animals are shown in our society, right? In movies, there's movies made about how dangerous sharks are. There are videos that you can watch of how dangerous sharks are. Our past experiences, so maybe we've had an individual experience with a shark or a dolphin that has shaped the way our brain maps those. What we have learned about these animals, right? Because of these experiences, our individual brains map dolphins to safety, right? And it maps sharks to danger. This is survival. This is our survival instinct. This is a mechanism in our brain so that when we are faced with a shark or we are faced with a threat or a danger, we are quicker to take action that'll help protect us and keep us safe. It's how we survive. It's how we've always survived. So who else are we taught are safe in our lives, right? Are we taught friends are safe, family's safe, our partners, our spouses, our pastors, our teachers, our coaches. Those are supposed to be safe. We're taught that those are safe people, safe adults, right? And who are we taught are dangerous people? Strangers, right? We're taught that stranger danger. Strangers are danger. People that we know are safe and trustworthy. Now let's think of it this way. When we think of domestic and sexual violence, who is most likely to be an abuser or perpetrator who's causing the trauma, right? In 7 of 10 cases, it's someone that survivor knows. It's a friend, it's a family member, it's a dating partner, a spouse. And that absolutely confuses our brains. It confuses the mapping that we were taught from the time we were little, that the people who are dangerous are strangers, not the ones that we know and we love. We are taught that those people are safe. And so now, when somebody that we know and that we love is hurting us, is causing us harm, I don't know what to do. I don't know how I'm supposed to respond. I wasn't taught this, right? So I'm going to shut down. I'm going to stay. I'm not going to fight back. I'm not going to call the police. I know and I love this person and I don't want them to go to jail. I'm not going to scream. I'm going to justify. I'm going to please and appease. I'm going to tend and befriend. I'm going to find something that I did wrong to cause this behavior because I am confused on why this person that I know and I love is hurting me. So what about police? How do we map them? Are they safe? Are they dangerous? And that's going to completely depend on your past experience with law enforcement and what you have been taught. If we've never had a negative experience and police have always been helpful, then we're probably going to map police to safety in our brains. However, if we have had negative interactions with law enforcement or dangerous interactions with law enforcement, then there's a likelihood that law enforcement is going to be mapped to danger in our brain. Not everybody is going to map things the same way that we do because everybody has unique experiences. So we have to remember, especially when working with survivors in marginalized communities, that they may have mapped police to danger, that they will not call 911, they will not report, they will not want to speak to police when they arrive, and they will not want to cooperate with an investigation. So do not always assume that police is a safe option for everyone.
So let's talk about some safety planning considerations. There is no cookie cutter safety plan that will work for everyone or work in every situation. So let's start out with how well do you know the survivor? Do you know them really well? Are they a close friend, family member, or current partner? You can use your close relationship as an asset when helping them make a safety plan. Maybe you know them a little, an acquaintance, coworker, neighbor, church member. Open the door to a deeper conversation and create an emotionally safe relationship with that person. Or maybe you don't know them at all. They could be a complete stranger. Start a conversation to let them know that you are a safe person. Do you know the survivor in a professional capacity, or do you have power over that survivor? And so you want to take a look at the role that you play in their life. Perhaps you're a supervisor, coach to an athlete, teacher to student, therapist to client, medical staff to patient, or you are somebody who is higher up in chain of command. All of these things can create power imbalance. So be sure to really investigate if you are able to keep things confidential, if they are to confide in you what is happening, or if you have an obligation to report to your employer. If you're at university, you could be required to report to the Title IX coordinator, Dr. Foster, or if you're a mandated reporter, you could be mandated to report to the appropriate authority. So make sure that you're really investigating the role you play in that person, and if you have a greater responsibility there. In looking at invisible barriers, lots of things are at play. A victim survivor may be feeling overwhelmed and having a trauma response. Therefore, they cannot emotionally regulate or cannot use higher functioning decision-making skills and are overwhelmed by your questions. So be sure to really be in the moment with that person and not to ask too many questions, and really let them take the lead in how that conversation goes. You may resemble their perpetrator or abuser, so your genuine offers of help and support may be activating their trauma. They may not feel comfortable talking about their situation based on your level of relationship with them, or they might be skeptical about how long your offers to help will last. So remember, this person may have experienced helpers in the past who tired of helping, who did not follow through on their offers to be supportive, and that's going to impact their decision making in the future in trusting that somebody is willing and able to help in an appropriate way. They may not feel comfortable sharing details of their relationship with people for fear of judgment, embarrassment, or shame. They may share parts of their story with you and keep other parts private. That does not mean that somebody is lying or being deceiving. It means that they're protecting themselves and they're providing you pertinent information that you may need to know to be helpful, but always give a victim survivor leeway to keep things private, because sometimes you don't need to know everything in order to be helpful. And so respecting a survivor's privacy is very impactful and such a sign of respect. They love and care about their abuser, and they do not want them to get in trouble, so they're cautious to talk to you or to tell you the full story. Additional considerations for college students. What is available to students is different than what's available to the general community. And so campus resources, including Title IX, equal opportunity, interim measures, those types of things are going to be afforded to students. So the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights enforces the Title IX of the Education Amendment of 1972. Title IX protects people from discrimination based on sex in education programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. Title IX states that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving that federal assistance. So if something were to happen to a student, faculty, or staff on Washburn's campus or at a university-sponsored event, or in their private time away from school and away from those academic settings, they can receive support from the university. Dr. Pam Foster is the Equal Opportunity Director and Title IX Coordinator for the university. She is who will meet with a victim survivor if they would like to make a report to the university about a sexual assault, stalking, sexual harassment, domestic violence, anything that they're experiencing. Dr. Foster is able to meet with them, provide them with resources, and talk them through some of those reporting options that are afforded to them as part of the Washburn community. If you are being supportive of a survivor, you can absolutely call Dr. Foster and ask questions that you may have about your responsibility to make reports. You can ask her questions about ways that she may be supportive of victim survivors, and any other information that you would like to request. At the bottom is the website that talks about how to make reports, what supports are available on campus, and also the policy and procedure for Title IX and equal opportunity at Washburn's campus. Some interim and protective measures that are available for students, faculty, and staff will be coordinated through the Title IX office, so that is Dr. Foster, but these things can be changes to campus housing, moving to a different dorm, changing class or work schedules, rescheduling class or work assignments and deadlines, transportation assistance, including police escorts to and from class or to your car, issuance of a campus no contact or notice to leave order, assistance in filing protection from abuse or protection from stalking order through our confidential resources on campus, university imposed suspension or administrative leave, on-campus counseling and medical services through counseling services and health services, campus victim advocacy, confidential and free through the main campus myself and through Shelley Bierman at the Washburn Tech campus. All of the Title IX resources and assistance in understanding what legal options are and assistance accessing those legal resources.
So this is why it's so important that you all are attending this special presentation today, because if we can learn how to support a survivor, if that survivor feels validated and supported and empowered, they are going to be more likely to engage in services. They are going to be more likely to engage in the criminal justice system. They might be more likely to seek support from an advocacy agency, seek medical assistance, or access other services in the community, which in turn allows for more abusers and more perpetrators to be held accountable, right? Which we talked about earlier, how so few abusers are actually going to spend any time behind bars. And in turn, that then makes our community more safe, right? When we can support survivors and hold abusers accountable, we are going to have a safer community for all. And so we definitely do not expect all of you or any of you to be experts in this area or to be able to be an advocate or provide advocacy or counseling services to a survivor in your own life. That is not the expectation here. But there are some things that we can all do to help support a survivor, to help them feel validated and empowered, and to help eliminate domestic violence in our communities. So when we listen first and we're listening to learn, right? We're just listening and we're silent and we're letting the survivor talk or not talk. We're not listening to fix it, right? We want to avoid that toxic positivity or silver lining the experience. We don't want to give that survivor advice. We don't want to jump to fixing the issue. We just really want to listen. We want to create a safe and calm environment. And we want to hear what they want and what they need. And we also want to hear what they don't want and what they don't need, right? We want to understand how that survivor sees their own situation, right? So they might refuse your help, or they might deny that anything even occurred, right? The survivor in the video that we watched, she specifically said, if a friend or if my doctor would have asked me if I was being abused, I would have said no. And that is okay. We have to remember to pocket our own frustrations, and we have to remember the perception, right? Just because we perceive the situation or we would have done something different doesn't mean that the survivor is wrong. Sometimes we just have to sit in that frustration and sit in that moment because the moment is not about us. It is about that survivor, and we want to keep them at the forefront and let them take the lead because they are the experts in their own life. We want to offer support, we want to offer encouragement, and we want to offer resources to help them achieve their goals when they are ready. So we want to always come from an empowerment perspective, right? Respecting their confidentiality, being open to what you have to report, if you have to report in that moment, asking what they need, and asking them permission before we do anything. So a little bit about the services that we provide here at the Center for Safety and Empowerment. So we want to first highlight that both the Washburn Advocacy Services and the Center for Safety and Empowerment Advocacy Services are both free and confidential, right? So the Center for Safety and Empowerment, we serve Shawnee, Jackson, and Wabunsee counties. We're a 24/7 advocacy agency. We can be reached by our hotline, which we'll have at the end. And then this is just a list of some of the resources that we provide at the Center for Safety and Empowerment. We are always happy to provide you with brochures. We are happy to provide you with hotline cards, because sometimes those can be easier to give to a survivor. So if you are ever in need of anything for your office, for your home, please let us know, and we will be happy to get information to you regarding our services.
And on Washburn's campus, both main campus and on the tech campus, we have court advocacy. Sorry, my screen went blank. Give me a second, you guys. Okay. Court advocacy, medical advocacy, emotional support, case management, assistance in safety planning, assistance in accessing community and campus resources, assistance in understanding victim rights and options, both on and off campus, and outreach and education. And one thing that I would also like to note, if we jump back to Title IX, is that there is no pressure for a student to report if they just want to talk about their experience, whether it was something that happened 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or 5 minutes ago. We're here to provide support. And a student meeting with Dr. Foster does not initiate any sort of investigation. Students are free to talk to Pam to understand their options and the policies at Washburn before they decide how to move forward. So it is so important for us to be mindful of our own biases, experiences, prejudices, assumptions, and privilege. You know, there are lots of beliefs about domestic violence that are untrue and just downright unhelpful. Some of those include, you know, the fact that it's just a women's issue. Men can't be victims. Men are always the perpetrator. Women can't be abusive. This doesn't happen in my neighborhood. The person who's choosing to stay in the abusive relationship is choosing to be abused. There's nothing I can do to help. It's none of my business what happens behind closed doors. When I experienced domestic violence, I did this, and this. It helped me. It should help them too. I called the police and they were really helpful to me. Leaving is always a safe option. And anger management, marriage, or couples counseling is going to be beneficial. You know, these are often things that we hear people say, and they're just untrue. And it's not helpful to say these types of things and perpetuate these beliefs, especially when we're talking to victim survivors. You know, being open and being able to step back and look at some of the beliefs that we hold and check in with us to make sure, check in with ourselves to make sure that we can kind of reset our mindset is really, really important, and really helps us to be ready to help someone in an unjudgmental way, non-judgmental way when they reach out to us for help.
So when we're thinking about what a survivor might want, right? They may want the abusive behavior to stop. They want the pain of the trauma to stop. They want accountability or justice. They want privacy and they want safety. They want to be heard. They want to heal. They want to gain back control. But we have to remember that the survivor in front of you may want all, they may want some, or they may want none of the things on this list. Because we have to remember that healing is different for everybody. It's going to look different for everyone. So listen to what that survivor wants, not what you want for them, but what they want, and empower them to do what they feel is best and most safe for themselves. The survivor is the expert in their own life. They're the expert in their situation. And we want to remember that and empower them to do what is best for them. So when I think of empowerment, right, I think that that survivor is in the driver's seat and you are in the car and you're helping with the navigation. And I know that when I get off track, my GPS reroutes me, right? And so that's what you're might have to do in a case when you're working with a survivor is reroute as their plans change, reroute as their goals and their needs change. We want to follow that survivor's lead and then provide information and discuss options to help them get to their goal. Whether their goal is to leave, whether their goal is to stay, whether their goal is to seek justice and go through the criminal justice process, or whether it's not. We want to make sure that we're giving back the survivor back their autonomy and their control, because we have to remember that that control and that autonomy was taken from them, right? They didn't have any control over the trauma that they experienced, but they do have control over their healing moving forward. So we owe it to them to make sure that we are giving them that space to heal in the way that they feel is best.
So when we're thinking about how we can support survivors of domestic violence, empathy is everything. Empathy is the most important aspect of, communicating your support of the other person. You may not know what to say, you may not be sure what to do, but if you approach with kindness and empathy, that is going to have the biggest impact.
So we are going to watch a short video. After this commercial.
Did you know they're called vacation days because you can take vacation?
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, woo, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
very rarely are you able to talk someone out of their pain. They're going to feel the way they feel and grieve those abusive relationships. So we're not trying to fix how they feel. What we are trying to do is be supportive. So making sure that the survivor feels heard, acknowledge their pain, trauma, and the injustice of their experience is what truly will be impactful. So things like, how are you feeling? I'm so sorry this happened to you. I'm here to help you when you are ready. These are making it known that you are not going to be bossy, that you are letting them, again, be in that driver's seat, but you also care how they're doing and you want them to know that they can count on you. It's normal for you to act this way or have a reaction in this way. It's okay if you don't remember. It's not your fault. Thank you for talking to me about this. I'm sure that was really hard for you. And what happened to you is devastating. Let's talk about some of the ways that I can be supportive of you. So again, you don't have to know the right thing to say, but sometimes having these things in that toolbox so that you can pull out and be supportive of the person who's confiding in you, who's right in front of you, can be really, really helpful.
And the other thing that we can do, besides providing a safe place and showing empathy and compassion, is that we can get involved and we can educate ourselves and educate our community about the impacts of domestic violence. And so with October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and as I spoke about at the beginning about our Week Without Violence, we do have some upcoming events coming up this week that you can get involved in your own lives, promote these events in your workplaces, in your social groups. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are all currently in, most of our events this year are being held virtually, like this one. However, there are other ways for you to get involved virtually and in person. So Thursday, we want you all to grab your purple and join the movement to shed light on domestic violence, reducing stigma around domestic violence, and advocating for survivors so that we can all work towards greater safety and equity. So wear your purple and show it off on social media, #Purple Thursday, and if you feel inclined to do so, tag us in it so that we know that you guys are all looking awesome in your purple on Thursday. Thursday evening at 5 o'clock, we will be having a virtual tour of our survivor services. So we talked a little bit earlier about the things that we do here at the Center for Safety and Empowerment. So now you can see it for your own eyes, and that'll kind of help so that when you're explaining it to a survivor, such as what our shelter looks like, what our offices look like, it might make them feel more comfortable coming and seeking support. So that'll be 5 o'clock. Virtually, so you'll have to register in advance, but we will be touring our Center for Safety and Empowerment offices, our Truth House, and our new Emory apartments, so that's very exciting. And then the energy of the week will accumulate at the annual rally at the Capitol, and we will be having that on the south steps of the Capitol building at 11:30. And this year we have an amazing lineup of empowered women who will be speaking about domestic violence in our community and the impact on marginalized communities. So we will be hearing from our YWCA CEO, Kathleen Marker. We'll be hearing from Felicia Glass, who is a local grief counselor and public speaker. And then we will be hearing from our very own Topeka Mayor, Michelle De La Isla, who will be shining a light on domestic violence here in our Topeka community and what we can all do to eliminate domestic violence. And we will have face masks. I have the Until Justice Just Is face masks that we will be giving out at the rally to ensure that everyone is keeping safe. We will not be doing a march this year, and we will not have hot dogs because of COVID. But we will have multiple agencies who are social justice focused, racial justice focused, who will be tabling at the Capitol. So we encourage folks to hang out and learn more about the wonderful work being done in our community. So with that, we have come to the end of our special presentation. So thank you all for those who are still with us. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box for Becca to see, and she can let us know, or you can unmute yourself and ask them if you have any. I just want to remind folks that this presentation has been recorded, so I will be sending out the recording to the email addresses that I have, which would be those who RSVP'd in advance. If you did not receive the presentation materials, the PowerPoint, and the handout, please let me or Molly know and we can get that to you. And then the last thing before we take questions, we will be putting an evaluation link in the chat box, and I will also send it out to those emails as well. I encourage you all to fill out the evaluation, as it really helps us as we are constantly seeking to improve our services, including our public education. So tell us what you thought about today's presentation. And we invite you to continue the energy into the rest of our week without violence. And we thank you all for listening and for participating in today's discussion. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them now in whichever way feels most comfortable to you. And we will stay on until 1 o'clock, or 2:30, sorry, I don't know what time it is, 2:30.
And I also just want to put out there that you can absolutely contact us yourselves. Use the hotline or the office, during the business day as a way to consult. Checking in with us to get our opinions or our ideas on how you can support people. You aren't in this alone, and you can also utilize our resources even if you are not the person who's experiencing violence.
Absolutely. Does anybody have any questions for Molly and I? We appreciate all the kind words in the chat box. Thank you all. We definitely don't want this conversation to end here. And so like Molly said, continue to have these conversations in your own lives, in your workplaces. And like Molly said, you are not in this alone. And as we stated in the beginning, together is the only way that we will be able to really make an impact on domestic violence in our communities. So once again, we just greatly appreciate everyone who attended today. And drop your email if you want the presentation materials, including a really awesome handout with kind of a flow chart of what to do when calling police is not an option. And it kind of summarizes all the wonderful things that we talked about today.
Hey, Emily, I have a question.
Yes, hello.
Hi, how are you, friend?
Good.
I have read an article this week that has me questioning all of my existence. And it was about a lot of things about the criminal justice system and its response to victims of domestic violence. And one of the points of the article was about how VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, has perhaps failed victims and survivors by overemphasizing an investment in the criminal justice response and not investing enough in resources like housing for survivors. And I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts about that, as I personally have advocated for the reauthorization of VAWA and some of those important policies, and now like really trying to think of these things, of course, intersectionally, and just curious about that, if you had any thoughts. Also, I can send you the article.
I was going to say, first off, can you send me the article? Because I would
so
love
it can ruin your life like it's ruined mine.
Cool. Yes, that's exactly what I want to do today. So it specifically talks about, I'm just reiterating, it specifically talks about the importance of housing for survivors instead of focusing so much on criminal justice.
Yeah, I mean, in general, it was talking about how like 40, 45 years ago, the movement, the domestic violence, the grassroots movement of advocacy really joined with, specifically with the criminal justice system, which had many benefits. But one of the downsides is that a lot of the resources, a significant portion of the resources then got devoted to enhancing the criminal justice system response, and that might not have actually been as beneficial to survivors as we think or thought, especially in the areas of like not having enough housing, not having enough resources to address some of those other critical needs.
I think I would say 2 years ago, I was working with a survivor, and they said something to me that struck me. I had asked, are you so excited? Like there was a conviction, and they looked at me with this puzzled look, and I was like, and they said something to the effect of, this wasn't justice for me. This doesn't change anything for me. My circumstances are the same. Like I'm still homeless. Like I'm still left with the lasting impacts of the abuse that I experienced. And so talking with them, what justice looked like for them was to be able to move on in a healthy way, with emotionally, physically, and so I would agree that where, there are times where the justice is not found in the courtroom, or through conviction or through punishments that people are given, but it's the potential and the ability to be resilient and have those resources that allow for survivors to rebuild.
And I think, oftentimes as a collective community, we think, the justice system is the end all be all, right? That this is the answer to the trauma that survivors are facing. And I think oftentimes the justice system can open a whole nother can of trauma. And we also see, in the, case that happened not too long ago in Jackson County with Ewing, and now that's all kind of being reversed, and how we had this great moment of, we saw justice, this person is going to be put away for a long time, and now there's a good chance that that's all going to unravel. And so I think that we should be putting more focus on improving our community resources, improving like our housing. And I know that we always say, we opened up these apartment complexes for survivors, which is great because it's going to allow us to have more beds. It's going to allow us to serve more people. It's going to allow us to specifically serve more families. But in reality, we could have 50 domestic violence shelters in our community, and that still won't be enough. And we will constantly have them full. And so I do think that we are not serving survivors in the best way possible. And so I say all that to say that I'm really looking forward to reading this article, because you said it was going to ruin my life. But I am, I'm always just, it's one of those moments where you're like, dang, I thought that this was the way to go and that we were doing all the right things, just to be hit with, oh, maybe not. And I think there's always room for improvement. So I'm thankful that this gap or that this improvement is being highlighted in articles like this. So I just think that we have a long way to go, and I don't know. I also read a very interesting article that's now being shared. I just got it. I saw it from the YWCA USA today too, about local advocacy agencies losing support and funding from their local law enforcement agencies for supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that that is a critical conversation to be having, because when law enforcement agencies say, hey, we're not going to support you anymore, we're not going to give you funding, we're not going to refer victims to you anymore, you can come and take all your brochures, we don't need them. Who is that really affecting, and who is that harming? That's really harming the victims and the survivors that we serve. Once again, playing into they have less access and lack of access to safety and support when we do things like that. And so I really found that to be shocking, I guess, that was some of the reaction that was happening in today's time around the Black Lives Matters movement and how advocacy agencies were being impacted.
And there's more to come on that as well, Emily.
Yes. I'm sure we are only seeing the beginning of that ripple effect.
Michelle, while you're on the call, can I ask you a question? Because this is one that I feel it's safe to ask you this question coming from the AG's office, whereas I might not ask other agencies. There is some concern among YWCAs with the president's executive order that was put in place on September 22nd, that as of November 22nd, federal grantors could require us to sign a statement that says we will not do any programming related to any diversity, equity, and inclusion training that includes certain wording. Is that something we can expect, do you think? Because the language is very broadly written, is what I'm hearing.
I'll be totally honest in that the agency that handles the federal pass-through dollars in Kansas is the Kansas Governor's Grants Program. And so they will be the entity that is navigating that particular rollout. And my guess, knowing the leadership there and knowing the staff there and sort of having a sense for how they've been implementing stuff, is that they very much are still including a lot of diversity, inclusion, intersectional information in the information that they are putting out. And so I'm not sure how they're going to be really addressing that. But I think that's a concern. And I think you probably know me well enough to know my opinion about this. Yeah. But I think, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see how they, if they're in a position to have to navigate that. I trust those folks right now who are in leadership roles to really be trying to prioritize how to make sure that the broadest definitions of are protected and supported. So.
And the interpretation that I'm hearing through YWCA CEOs and through that group is that the language is very broad, and it says that the agencies may enforce this in their grants. And they think it was written that way because they think it probably was not really enforceable without it going through Congress. And so they think that's why it was written that broadly, which might make it hard to enforce. So I think that's the hope that we're hanging on to.
Yeah, it might be really challenging, because I would guess that some things, elements about that order put other federal laws put it in conflict with other federal laws. And so am not an attorney. I just play one on TV, but I'm guessing that that would be a legal battle. So, so I think that's interesting, concerning for sure, concerning for sure.
Annette, I see that your hand is raised. Did you have a question? You're muted.
I have a comment, but I see that we're also close to ending time.
You're fine.
I just wanted to say to Michelle, McCormick and all, not to be too dismayed. I think that our response to and our treatment of survivors and victims of domestic abuse has been done with the best intentions at heart, with the information that we knew, doing the things that we thought was best for a very vulnerable and very precious population. And there is an author whose name I can't remember that reminds us that we cannot live without our lives. And I know the work of domestic violence agencies has helped women and men to stay alive. Even personally, the things that may not have been addressed through an agency, I was alive to seek other help and other resources. And now that we're getting some information that possibly says that our focus needs to change, we can act on that and work toward that to truly do the best that we know how to do for survivors and their families.
Absolutely. Thank you, Annette, for always bringing the inspiration and the power of strength.
Yes, Annette, and just like that, you saved my life. It's no longer ruined. Thank you.
That was easy. Perfect. So if anybody else has any questions, or if nobody else has any questions, then we will go ahead and end this wonderful presentation. I just want to send 100 thank yous out to everybody who joined us, the familiar faces and the new faces. And we hope that we see you all at the rally at the Capitol on Friday. So have a great rest of your week and continue fighting the good fight.
Emily?